Hello, I'm Behruz Kamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Center for Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani for the study of Iran and the Persian Gulf. Today I'm so happy to introduce our next speaker, Seema Golestaneh from Cornell University. And we were just talking with Professor Golestaneh about our lecture series this semester, and I shared with her that we saved the best for last for our lecture series for this semester, and unfortunately, again, we faced a corona crisis, and we had to cancel all our events, and so I thought that maybe this is not going to be the real thing, but at least we can have a conversation and get to know Professor Golestaneh's work a little bit better, and our invitation still is on the table. The moment we can travel again and have public events, I am 100% sure that we would extend the invitation again to Dr. Golestaneh to visit us. Professor Golestaneh is an anthropologist, graduated from Columbia University in 2014, where she also got her master's degree from. Her research generally is on anthropology of Islam and contemporary Sufi thought and Sufi networks and aesthetics and meditation. And she has a number of very important publications in relation to these topics in journals like comparative studies of South Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, and also cultural anthropology. Her work is mostly concerned with the question of Sufi networks in Iran and Sufi knowledge production in Iran. And I'm sure this is a topic that is close to many of our members of our community's heart, because this is really one of those moments that exactly because there is an Islamic Republic in Iran, many other trends and networks and expressions of religion in Iran is sort of became secondary. And I'm so glad that we have this chance to have this conversation with Professor Golestaneh. So why don't you share with us a little bit in general about your research and what are you working on? And I know that you're working on a book manuscript, and I can tell from my own perspective that I am eagerly waiting to read that manuscript when it comes out. So here is Professor Golestaneh. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Kamari Tabrizi. I really appreciate the kind invitation, and I'm also so excited about the center as a sort of a new place for new research in Iran, and also what its and ideas that come out of Iran, sort of for the broader humanities, social sciences. So as you mentioned, I will be speaking broadly today about what is called mystical thought in Iran. And there are, of course, many different currents of what is called mysticism within the Iranian context and the broader Islamic world. Sufism, mysticism goes by many names. There's tasawwuf, there's irfan, Sufigari. And for folks who are interested, there's a really wonderful book by Atta Anzali, who exactly discusses in more detail the divergences why tasawwuf and irfan and Sufigari became these separate sort of entities. And what I always found really fascinating, and what I'd like to do eventually more research on, is how threads of mystical thought can be found in so many different places within Iran. You see references in pop culture. You see city beautification projects using, what is often within the sort of mystical canons. And then you also see within the seminary systems in Qom today, in the past, tasawwuf as an area of study. Famously, Ayatollah Khomeini also specialized in tasawwuf, and it's an interest he had, throughout much of his life, and He wrote poetry, which is still being published and translated by his institute for the compilation of his works now. And Ahu Najafian is writing about Mr. Poetry, which is, I'm really excited about that too.
Yes.
And so you see it really, it creeps in all these different unexpected places. So within this broader milieu, what I focus on for this project that I'll be speaking about, Unknowing and the Everyday, is really self-identified Sufi groups. So these are collectives who refer to themselves as dervish or fuqara, or usually both, and have some sort of claim to or affinity to Shah Nimatullahi Valley.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually would go, I think through my research I've seen, I think almost all ethnic Persian Shia Sufi groups have some sort of tie to Shah Nimatullahi Valley. I mean, there's who don't, but many lay claim to this. And I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. So as I mentioned, my research is limited to ethnic Persian and groups who are very much Shia Sufis. Within Iran, there are others. For example, there are the Qadiris. There are Sunni, largely Kurdish order. But I focused about these, Persian Shias, and I did research in the cities of Isfahan, Kerman, Tehran, and to a much lesser extent, Shiraz too. And my case studies are all with different groups. Some of these groups are very localized, meaning it's just like a local leader, a local sheikh, and others have a sort of national presence with branches throughout the country. And I'd also be happy to talk about different formulations of tariqas, orders, versus group, how I'm sort of categorizing them too, because complicated. And so when I went out to do this research, I was initially interested in the role of poetry. What position did it hold for these different groups and other, folks within Iran today? But what I found was more about questions of knowledge and what are these different types of Sufi epistemologies. And what I found was that even though a lot of these epistemologies, these forms of knowledge can be very abstruse, sort of seemingly abstracted, they're actually used as ways to navigate the social material world. They're not particularly escapist or transcendent even. Mm-hmm. And again, so this type of knowledge, it's known as marifat, and it's related to obviously to the same fawn. And I translate that as unknowing. It's often seen translated in English as gnosis. And again, I'm happy to talk about that translation choice. But unknowing or non-knowledge and marifat, these are seen, again, I use them interchangeably. These are seen as very much distinct from other forms of knowledge like ilm, other forms of reasoning, aql, and has an interesting relationship to ethics, akhlaq, where it's a part of it, so sort of extends beyond it too. So, within, Islamic thought, there are thousands probably of interpretations of marifat. What I found with the groups I worked with, and what I'm going to do a little bit of a reverse thing, I'm going to talk about the ideas I found within, the case studies and then get to the case studies, but I think it helps. Yeah. Yes. So what I found with marifat, it's that it's an idea that's first and foremost based on the unknowability of God. Mm-hmm. It's basically impossible for humans to fully understand the divine. And what's interesting is that these Sufis, rather than seeing this as a limit, see it as a place to kind of inhabit this limit point. The finality of human thought is a place where they kind of dwell, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so they operate from this position of accepting and emphasizing that there will always be that which we do not know. And so thinking that, there's always that which is beyond, I say non-knowledge is, or, gnosis, marifat, is not a form of anti-knowledge or sort of meta-knowledge, but it's an awareness that there's always that which we do not know. It's an engagement awareness too. It's not a sort of passive thing. It's an engaged awareness that sometimes that we know nothing in compared to the divinity of all things. Or as one of my interlocutors put it, and I'll quote her directly, she says, quote, "There's always that which is beyond what we are thinking." Now, I think it's fair to say most Muslims would agree that God is inherently unknowable. But again, these Sufis take this conceit as the foundation of their broader epistemology. As another interlocutor, Sheikh Mustafa told me, he tells me about sort of the interminable nature of Sufism is one of its most defining features. This quote, "The road to God is endless because God is infinite. Constantly we have to go on and accept to go on. When you stop, you are no longer a Sufi." So it's this very, interminable, not Sisyphusian, because as we see, it can be very generative kind of process. And within non-knowledge, there remains some element of understanding, a self-conscious awareness, but it's an awareness that something remains unresolved. And I'll just give one more quote. This is by Ajnu Ali Tawande, the quote of the Sultan Ali Shahi order, who recently passed away just this past November. And he gives the definition of Irfan as quote, he says literally, "Irfan is knowing, yet knowing has different stages. Gnosis is not an absolute matter," says Irfan again. "It is something that, as the philosophers say, is graduated, tashkihi, and faith, which have degrees. More than anything else, this process continues endlessly." So this is, again, another really key aspect of that it really contests the finality of thought. So it's a process kind of without endpoint. There's always exist, again, beyond which we know. And I would say that at this point, some people say like, well, isn't this sort of like solipsism? You just keep going. Solipsism has usually you reach a conclusion and then you keep going forward. This is just the fact that of this thing that you play with that is always dynamic. It's always, it requires engagement. So I think it's very different from that. So again, it lets you, what does this mean now to apply it to something? When you want to unknow something. And this is where it gets, for me, this gets the anthropological bit gets in, this is where the ethnography comes in, because this is all very interesting and fine on the page. But it was really these ideas I saw within these ethnographies, how people came to kind of play with these ideas. And sometimes it was actually very playful, as we'll see. Because when you want to unknow something, it takes, could be a concrete entity and make it kind of unravel it. It blurs its beginnings. It can sort of render, the familiar into the strange, to the unfamiliar as well. And this is when I saw, these ideas, seemingly could be constricted onto the page, spill out onto the street in a way. Okay. So that's, this is what I kind of extracted from my studies, and the rest of the time, I want to go through some of my case studies, I hope. And if it goes long, just let me know. I have
No, that's fine. That's fine. I'm so fascinated by this. I mean, please take your time.
Thanks. It's the Sufis. So the first case study I call Unknowing of Text. It's Unknowing of Authority. And this is based on two separate groups. And these are very small Sufi orders. They're two basically poetry reading groups. They have their own sheikhs. And what I found is that they shared a similarity about their methods of textual interpretation, of text. And so the first part, their sort of hermeneutic stance was that the more you read, the more questions you will have, essentially. Reading the interpretation of a text leads not to sort of correct answers, but to more questions, your more difficult layers of questions. In this way, the text is endless. So this is how you kind of unknow the text. Words able to convey, countless ideas. And it leads to ever kind of deeper philosophical musings. So, I joke sometimes, it was like, the deconstructionists,
Right.
Or just not even in Sufi circles, you've seen this a lot. It takes 40 years to know, the first 18 lines with a Masnavi, things like that.
That's right.
Interesting too, because it has a lot of resonance for how they think about authority. And sometimes I saw a disconnect between how the sheikhs understood their role and how followers understood it too. Because here, it's not just about the text and all the possibilities within the text, but also how they view, the person, the sheikh who's guiding them. Because the sheikhs would say, one of them, he would always say, I don't give the right answers, I give the right questions. So it can be very different from other forms of, let's say ijtihad, which are not necessarily tied to poetry per se, and when the most skilled person has the best, at least, interpretation, even if there are many others. So here it's another form of understanding sort of the text. And as I say, it's their ability to guide their students to find the appropriate questions. And how it was very interesting working with these two fellows, because one, they're both older, retired. They had some sort of training, but they also had careers totally unrelated. One had a little bit of a crisis of conscience about it, because he's like, I believe this, but I don't know who should have any. He's like, who can lead? And the other was much more gregarious about it. He's like, no one knows anything, and so, and he would, make proclamations like, I am dust, I am this. And so I would see how this unraveling of the text has very different ramifications for authority. Of course, textual authority is so tied to authority. So the second case study I have is Unknowing of Self and Body. And this looks at how people's interpretations of zikr rituals and sense of self. In particular, I'm interested in ideas of fana. So fana, annihilation of the self, is typically, I'm generalizing here, it's understood to be achieved through the zikr ritual, which means remembrance, and always has, in these cases, it has a musical component, usually a daf, sometimes a kamanche, there's poetry recitation, and no one here is going to some crazy state of hall or, state of ecstasy or something, but there's a musical component involved. And the idea is that through the zikr, you can, lose a sense of self. So in order to become closer to God, achieve tawheed, which is not just monotheism or affirmations of monotheism here, but sort of a union with God. And so what I found is that this is another totally separate group I worked with who had the loosest kind of organization, is that there were very different responses about zikr and fana in particular. So some described their experience of fana using much more classical, typical kind of language. They talk about the nafs, the loss of the sort of spirit, or the nafs amara, like the lower self, base things. They talked about nabudi, non-existence, things like that. So understandings of the loss of self, which are more typically found in, more classical literatures. And then the other group talked about loss of self through closer to what we might consider sort of identity politics. They talk about of sort of a socio-political identity, a loss of a gendered identity, the idea that I don't think of myself as an unemployed person. I have this, it's a much more kind of, not exactly rupture into it more, but a loss of self in much more quotidian terms than the other group, where it's totally irrelevant. Anything of the socio-material world, the political world is like, this is not the time for that. This is not a removal for that. And so I talk about this kind of destabilization of subjectivity as something desirable right now within this moment within Iran. And then I sort of compare a bit these ideas of loss of self to discussions that have been had earlier in Iranian sort of intellectual history, mostly with Jalal Allah Ahmad, has written in Qaib Zadigi, talks about sort of faceless youth, Miyai, Simayi, And also Shariati, who of course has written about Bozgash Rechiston, and also some other transformations of self. And so with Al Ahmed, this loss of self is very much tied to, you know, how Iranian selfhood has been lost in the face of sort of colonial encounters.
Right.
And it's, for him, it's very much a return to something. Shariati, so it's a very different understanding of loss of self. And I see how in this moment, at least on, you know, what we call the left, that does not seem to be a major concern, perhaps, or at least that's my argument. Iran. Shariati is a bit more complicated, as he often is, as his sort of return to self is less about, it is certainly involved with, you know, sort of the colonial encounter and the loss of self in the wake of, you know, Qarab Sadeghi and the rest. But there's also, he does also speak about transformation of subjectivity. So it's not just a return, there's a bit of return, but there's also transformation. He talks about this with his concept of Shahidi. In other parts, he talks about becoming like a maktab, like a school of thought. So there is some element of, you know, transformation, loss, but then the sort of answer to that loss is a little bit more complicated. That Allah. So I kind of try to position these different Sufis' ideas, the ones who seem to totally disregard, you know, the socio-political realm, the other ones who are interpreting this classic Sufi idea within it. Okay. Then I have the third case study, I'll try to keep this quick, looks at, actually is about sort of memory. And this is about there was a destruction actually of a Sufi Khanaqah in Isfahan, in Taqi Fulad. It's, you know, cemetery, but it's more like a necropolis, in February 2009. But the Sufis, after initially trying to stop the destruction, had a really interesting response in that after, again, the initial pushes, they said we should remember to forget this. So rather than actively mourn the site, there are discussions about, you know, we don't need to think about the material, you know, we need to think about the other world. You know, we have to think about the Batan and things like that, the haqiqat, the real, the world of the divine. So I don't go too much into the destruction. I can talk about that more. That was about a beautification project of Taqi Fulad, where UNESCO had named it, not a World Heritage Site, but some like Islamic Heritage Site, so they're transforming it. What I look at really at this chapter is their reaction, why they decided to take this stance. And it's very interesting because I got a wide variety of responses, and a lot of it was tied to how close I was to the people. So some people didn't talk about it at all, or some people said it happened. Others who I knew better spoke to it more freely or referenced it, were like, yeah, let's not talk about that. And then I also look to how these commemoration, how this type of remembrance, or rather this command to remember, to forget, it holds similarities and differences to forms of commemoration within Iran more broadly, and thinking about differences about remembrance, of course, is so popular, and mourning within, you know, the Islamic Republic, and how there are similarities between sort of remembrance and zikr, and how zikr is often about rendering present. And so I see that rather than being a very, and so there's different forms of kind of rendering present that's espoused by both the Sufi group and also, I think, I guess the authorities, the folks who are trying to do the memorialization. A little bit, and you know, remembrance is full with all the, in the Shia canon, Nahj al-Balagha is full of remembrance, full of zikr. So I look a little bit about those two, and sort of memory, what that means. And finally, my last case study, this is perhaps the most, I spoke about play earlier. This looks at a group of young people, and it's called Unknowing of Place, and how they, the group of young people young Sufis wanted to meet. And this was kind of in the wake of some larger Sufi meetings who were sort of canceled, frowned upon. So they said, okay, this group wanted to meet. They decided to switch homes every week.
Mm-hmm.
What they did was rather kind of curious in terms of how they wanted to convene the meetings. And so instead of just saying, okay, this is this address, show up, they said, okay, we want to think about Sufi ideas of wandering, sargardon, and also sama.
Mm-hmm.
What they would do is give each other a name of an intersection, neighborhood, say, okay, go to this intersection, and then listen for the sounds of some sort of music, irfani music, sometimes it would be like traditional music. And the idea was that they would broadcast it from a courtyard or even outside of an apartment building. And the people would have to follow the sounds to try to locate the spot. Now, ultimately, if you found this, like text somebody, this is before smartphones, you'd be like, I'm here, which apartment, which apartment.
Uh-huh. That's so
Technology
fascinating.
was certainly involved. Sometimes it always becomes quotidian. So the idea was that, I asked them why they were interested in this, and they said, well, we thought about it's a way of engaging with these different ideas that we talk about. But what I found was it really is a way of not just reimagining the possibilities for a neighborhood and how to know a space and place, rather, but also this idea of play and turning to they play with the heroes of Sufi of old, the old as, but also it's a form of literal interpretation. Because before, very few, there are the qalondanos, the wandering folks who still around in small number. I didn't work with anyone very closely at all. Unsurprisingly, they don't want to talk that much. So before, when they talk about Samo, and especially Sargardon, it's sort of metaphorical, which is complicated in its own way, but non-figurative. What I thought was really fascinating was that these young Sufis were taking a literal interpretation, and literal interpretations are often seen as this very kind of unthinking, uncritical approach to ideas. But here, it's a very playful and kind of creative way of applying, these very central tenets of Sufism. And again, I wish the ideas themselves. So I think, that's, this formation, I'll end up with that, Sufi soundscape, a listened for soundscape. And I'm happy to talk about everything.
This is incredibly fascinating, and there are so many different layers that one can engage with your case studies, as well as the framing of the project. That really, I don't think we have enough time to go over all those questions. I have many questions. But I want to start with sort of a little bit more general questions that at the beginning you mentioned that you focused on ethnically Persian Sufi orders, and I wonder do you think, because I always notice this from the outside, that there's some sort of ethnic correspondence to different Sufi tariqas. And so is this true? Is there sort of, can one think about different orders with reference to different ethnicities, or are there sort of crossovers, and how this play out in real life?
Yeah, so I can say, I definitely think within the Iranian context, if anyone has claims to, or is, identifies as some part of the silsila of Shah Ni'matullah Valley, they're almost entirely ethnically Persian. Found very few, I haven't heard of any actually, I have to say, Kurdish, different Arab groups or something who are part of that. So there are folks in South Asia actually who have who claims, and the order themselves the son of Shah Neamatullahi Vali actually spent time in the Deccan in Bihar in India, and there was a Neamatullahi presence there for hundreds of years. And recently on YouTube, I've seen Shah Neamatullahi Vali's writings are used by South Asians to do sort of divination and fortune telling. They're all in Urdu. So I've only, I don't know Urdu, so I've bugged some friends to tell me. So I do think they do have it's not a purely ethnic ties to it. What's interesting though too, because Shah Neamatullahi Vali himself was a Sunni, and when people ask, when that's, and he is very much tied to the area. He wandered for many years and ended up in Kerman for like, I don't know, decade of wandering, probably more. Although if you ask folks why, like, oh, it's interesting that the head of this order was a Sunni, and they say, no, it's taqiyya, it was a bad time, it was really a secret.
Right.
So that's kind of contested. And within Iran, it's interesting. I think a lot of it, why there's not more mixing, say, of the Sufi groups. I think it has to do with some of the sort of the revival, if you want to call it, is of especially Neamatullahi Sufism is really tied to the late 19th century. And by then, I think it ended up sort of circulating within more Persian, sort of ethnic Persian circles, I think. I wonder if there had not been a migration if there was more kind of back and forth between, or more research, I have to say, between, South Asia and Iran, we could maybe see how it is, in fact, does have a sort of multi-ethnic component. With the Sultan order, at least they have a website, and their website has lots of translations of their writings, and the idea is for people who are outside of Iran. So people are happy to cultivate this idea, or happy to, if they don't, at least this time there's no like Persian exceptionalism, at least. But it's interesting why it sort of hasn't been more pollinating between the group.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. Of course, I at the beginning I mentioned this, that your project is doubly fascinating, exactly because of that we have an Islamic Republic in Iran, and then it in so many different ways it sort of forced the issue in seminaries, in different sorts of places of learning in the Shi'i world, to in one way or another to come to terms with this question.
Yes.
And in that otherwise sorry that if we didn't have an Islamic Republic in Iran, maybe these questions would have unfolded in so many different ways. But of course, the curiosity always is the question of Khomeini, and the way Khomeini situated himself as a person who is invested and interested in these forms of knowledge and marifat, and an advocate of sorry, an advocate of mysticism, a very strong proponent of Rumi poetry, which was all these things, or he taught courses in Irfan in seminaries. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how these centers of learning, Shi'i learning seminaries in Qom or Mashhad or Isfahan, how do they reconcile these two sort of ways of understanding religion and forms of knowing? Because one obviously is more sort of geared towards formal, juridical, theological, and the other is more geared towards marifat and gnosis. And as the way you translate, I want to have a question about the translation unknowing.
Oh, yes.
So how do they view this? What kind of conversation has this generated within the seminaries in that sense?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a very important question. It's something I'd really love to see more about. Well, one, I just, as you mentioned, with Ayatollah Khomeini's contributions to studies of Irfan, Tasawwuf, and the seminaries, and I really think there's a very long history of involvement with various Sufi intellectuals or even members of formal orders who have a presence within the seminaries. There's someone actually who, Sayed Amir Asghari, who is a PhD student now at Indiana. He is doing a really fabulous work about the, conversations between different Sufi groups and the seminarians. So we'll see more evidence about this. Just another kind of side about that, which I'd like to do more research on, is that, of course, perhaps the most famous kind of esoteric Ayatollah is also Ayatollah Tabatabai, who has such important, he does not get more esoteric. And he has 12 volumes of, Hafiz, tafsir, along with his crazy Quran, tafsir. And so many of his students were so active in evolution. And he was, I guess you could call him a quietist in a way. And the fact that he was still revered during and after, I think, is a very interesting thing. So about how, these debates are come to be, I do think it is still slightly controversial. Not all schools will have like a major kind of, and it's never Sufiyari, of course. It's usually Tasawwuf, actually, more than Irfan has the more literary bent. And, it's maybe not the best answer, but there's just, it's very interesting how individualized it is, how some folks say, Rafat, that's superstition, that's fine if it's just poetry, but, you can't compare, you should use it in, tafsir of the Quran and things, but other folks will say, no, that has great insight, and it's, how invested they are in sort of the batan of the Quran. A lot of people will posit it as, well, how important is, there's the Shariat and then there's Tariqat. Shariat is the realm of ethics, rationality, etc. And then people usually, thinkers who are supportive of this, of, emphasizing the sort of Irfan, botany, esoteric aspect, they'll accuse people of neglecting the Tariqat, which is the real closeness. So they say that they often will say that we shouldn't think of them as oppositional. They are either, two sides of the same coin, or to go even further, the Sufis themselves usually it's a lot of these layers, they'll say that they'll privilege the Tariqat over the Shariat, for example. So a lot of times those who, I looked at more, those who sort of support it will say that they are in tandem, they're not in opposition. So they're often a little bit defensive and say it's not about drug use, it's not about this. It always involves akhlaq, it always involves it's not just going to crazy ecstasy. You need that, but you also need the sort of intimacy and thinking about tawhid and things like that.
And that's very, very interesting. Of course, I have a little anecdote here.
Oh, please, yeah.
I was, many years ago, I had a conversation with Dr. Surush, and he told me that after the revolution, just a few months after the revolution, he started this radio program on the poetry of Maulana, the poetry of Rumi, and so after a few episodes of this program on the radio, apparently it created an uproar in Qom. That what's happening here? There are people on the radio, they're talking about Rumi and mysticism and all these things, and they pressured the radio to cancel his program. And he said that it was only with the intervention of Ayatollah Khomeini that they continued the program to be broadcast. Yeah. So I thought that this is such an interesting kind of conflict that
Yes.
obviously
Yeah.
at the time no one was paying attention to this kind of conflicts, but nevertheless these issues were always present at the time.
No, absolutely. And at the same time, in the early days when Ayatollah Khomeini was doing the public, he was doing his tafsir of the Quran
Uh-huh.
public, that's
Yeah,
when he also makes very clear statements
that's
about
right.
his support
Yeah,
for Wolf and the Bhutan and things like that.
that's
So
right. That's right. That's
at
right.
any opportunity, it's really
Yeah,
interesting.
no, that's very
So,
fascinating. I
yeah.
wanted to talk a little bit about the question of silence.
Mm,
We talk about the question of unknowing and ma'rifat or gnosis, and the fact that these kind of hermeneutic engagement is rather open-ended. It's not about coming to a conclusion. It's about opening up different kinds of possibilities
right.
of engagement with the divine and with life in general. And of course the question is then uh, the affability of this form of knowledge
Mm,
and the significance of silence.
mm,
So once you enter that world of that particular form of ma'rifat, uh, and of course, if I'm not mistaken, the understanding is that it's not only the question of intellect, it's a question of the whole body that you merge with the subject. And then the question is how that moment becomes affable. How can you
mm,
speak about it? And of course, then related to that is the question of silence. And what
right.
is the significance of silence in communicating, in transmitting that form of marifat on our unknowing? I know this is sort of a very sort of a general
No,
broad
that's
question,
beautiful.
but I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the significance of silence and ineffability of knowledge.
Mm. No, thank you. That's really beautifully said. And silence is something I'm quite interested in. I'll start by saying silence comes up in it makes me think of sort of two things. One, language, and then the ineffability makes you think of materiality and going back and forth. So silence with language is always that, words and trying to express the, encounters with the divine, trying to express divine, matter of fact, not divine knowledge, but, experiences, this experiential kind of knowledge, you're always going to fall short. So there's the engagement with poetic language, which leads itself to a certain form of knowledge and, not a direct answer, things like that. But you are ultimately always going to, it's another impossible task. And then, of course, famous Maulana Rumi himself, one of his pen names, Homoshi, is silence.
Yes.
And it's that ultimately, it's only silence is able to express what we have to say. And then it makes me think too, one of the groups I work with, they don't do any sort of zikr or even sama. They don't have any sort of musical component, but they have silent zikr. And they think, which is an old practice actually, even in the Middle Ages, there was the talk of the zikr of the tongue and the zikr of the heart. And for them, though, this is still a heightened form, the silence. So it's a way of engaging with it. And then the material and affability, I also find it really interesting. And I didn't talk about it too much, so I get a little bit into this with music and the body, because it's at a very they use music and aesthetics, so very material things as a means to gain access to, you listen to this music as a means to gain access to that which is ultimately ineffable. And so it's at this weird, there's types in other forms, they'll say it's always about sort of transcending the material. So there is that element too. It's like going beyond perception But then for folks who do engage with zik and have a lot of aesthetic theories about sama and, you know, breathing techniques in the body, it's a way of engaging the material to gain access to that which is immaterial, that which. So it's these sort of moments of between the material and immaterial that is really, I think, really interesting.
Yeah, no, that's so fascinating. It reminds me of this opera by Arnold Schoenberg.
Oh,
That he wrote this opera called Moses und Aaron. And of course, he spelled Aaron with one A rather than Aaron, because he was very superstitious, and he thought number 13 is bad omen, because if you add up letters of Moses,
all the numbers,
Aaron, it would be 13 letters. So he spelled, but that's a side note.
That's very funny.
But it's an interesting opera that you know, in the Old Testament, there's a story that Moses had a speech impediment.
Interesting.
And then Schoenberg turns that speech impediment into a theological position of the ineffability of God. And
wow.
So in the opera, actually, Moses never sings.
It's always Aaron.
It's always Aaron who's singing, you know. So,
yeah.
So in a sense, I mean, that's a sort of a kind of it's the same kind of questions that once you make something affable and you speak, you bring it into sort of the language of words, then inevitably you're transforming it. But if you want the real thing, you need to hear it from the silence of Moses in the opera. You know, so.
No, that's amazing. And it's also that sometimes it can be very burdensome. You know, Aaron has to do so much.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
I mean, Moses carries a heavy burden, but so does Aaron.
But so does Aaron, of course, yeah.
Well, the material, it makes you think of sort of a line by Bataille who says, I live my life not by logical explanation, but by tangible experience. Or I try to explain myself. So it's like it's not explanation.
That's right.
It's ultimately very difficult to translate.
I also, I mean, to sort of wrap it up a little bit, I want to ask a question about gender.
Oh, yes.
You know, and so how gender relations work in, at least in the case studies that you had. How does it unfold, and what's the role of gender in terms of you know, networking and production of knowledge and all different kinds of sort of institutional positions. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Oh, certainly. So I will say, first, to begin with, every single group I worked with was about roughly 50-50 men. And then within that, I would say all the highest ranking people were men. But within that, there were certainly women who were, one had the title of Sheikhia, but there were certainly women who were running things. A lot of, especially for the larger groups, a lot of the logistics were often run by women. And so they were very much involved in organizing. They were privy to, you know, a lot of sort of decision-making processes. These are for the larger groups, which have more, you know, bureaucracy, kind of financial things. Amazing, making food to give out for, you know, holidays. But it wasn't ever, and some of the group, one of the, I can say the Sultan and Shah, when they would meet, the meetings were always gender segregated. If we meet in a house, the men were downstairs, the women were upstairs, and then like the recording would hear it from upstairs. But then the qud for the sheikh would come upstairs to the women's section. I'll tell one brief story. I might have mentioned this to you even, but first time I went, to one of these meetings, you to wear a, you know, chador, but I had one of the black ones. But when I went there, most of the women were wearing the very like colorful flower, the ones. And so I went there and I kind of stood out a little bit with the black. Then when the Hut went upstairs, I was trying to, a lot of the women sort of crowded around him or just to hear him. And then I heard this woman next to me say to, her friend, she's like, let this girl go. She's from like, a Shahristan Omala, she's I'm from out of town. So I was like, yes, I'm from out of town. I was like the country bumpkin wearing all black. Anyway, but then, and then with groups that were younger, I would say there was absolutely mixed. It was very social. It was men and women of the younger folks into their 30s. So they're all involved in organizing. They're all involved. The ones that were, autodidact groups, they were self-taught. There really wasn't that much difference at all in terms of participation. The biggest difference, I think, would just be when there was a sheikh, it would be usually a man. And then there were women who were, again, given and held in high regard. I did do a little bit more work with women, but I was, they were very open. It really varied a lot, I have to say. There were, men who didn't feel comfortable shaking my hand. There were others who did, who were like, who made a point to show that they were very inclusive and wanted to show that their gender. And one of the groups, there's a very big meeting space, and that was not, that was a little bit more kind of underground, to say, but that was not gender segregated. So, and it's funny because I didn't realize, of course I had read all the literature, but I'm surprised by how many people still think it's surprising that there's women involved, attended. There are no events that women wouldn't go to, a male-only event. And in gender segregated, they were counterparts. And in terms of gender ideas, they were just sort of as influential or had just as many thoughts. They probably kept more dream journals, a little bit more, I would say, in terms of gender knowledge than men I encountered, but not by much.
So am I correct to assume that this is basically more middle-class families and women, or not?
There's a pretty big range. So it's more middle class. Sometimes the people who are the leaders tend to be more a little upper middle class. But then there are also people who, especially some of the older folks who did not have high school educations. And then there are a lot of people who, I think generally it's a middle class kind of phenomenon, but many who also were of more working class. And then you definitely saw folks who were, had graduate degrees. There were doctors involved, engineers. So people who espouse the term Darwish, at least I found of many different class backgrounds. It's very class. Even to folks who kind of, sell knickknacks on the side of the road or just, make up things. We're adhere to this too.
This is so fantastic. Seema, this was such an amazing conversation, and
thank you so
again,
much for the opportunity.
there's so many questions that I still have, and so I'm banking them that next time we talk to you, and we'll hopefully we'll bring you down here to Princeton, and we continue this conversation.
Oh, absolutely! It's my absolute pleasure, and thank you so much again for this wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, of course, it's
all at any time.
All right. So thank you so much, and stay safe and healthy, and we'll be in touch.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much again.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.